There is a particular quietness to the study at Down House when it is imagined in the final years of Charles Darwin's life. The room is orderly but lived in, filled not with ceremonial grandeur, but with the small instruments of patient attention: a worn chair, a sturdy writing table, neatly folded letters, magnifying lenses, jars, pinned specimens, and the faint, dry scent of paper handled over many years. Beyond the windows lie the soft fields of Kent, hedges shifting in the wind, garden paths darkened by damp soil, and the sandwalk, the familiar circuit on which he took his measured turns. Nothing in that room suggests conquest in the ordinary historical sense. There are no swords, no seals of state, no dramatic trophies. And yet from rooms like this, and from thoughts ordered with immense care across many years, came one of the great changes in human understanding. His life has often been remembered through a few emblematic images: the young naturalist aboard His Majesty's ship Beagle, the bearded old man in his garden, the author who waited so long before publishing the book that would alter biology. But his story was never only one of sudden revelation. It was not a single flash of insight standing alone in the mind. It was slower than that, and in some ways more human. It was a life of reading and pacing, of collecting and doubting, of illness and family routine, of long delays that were not merely hesitation, but part of the very texture of his work. He became a revolutionary thinker without ever seeming to resemble the loud or theatrical kind of revolutionary. Outwardly, he lived with the habits of an English country gentleman. Quietly, he altered the framework through which life itself was understood. The world into which he was born was already full of questions about nature, order, and design. The old certainties had not yet disappeared, but they had begun to feel pressure from expanding science, from empire, from geology, from voyages, and from the accumulation of facts that no longer sat comfortably within inherited explanations. He did not create that age of inquiry by himself, but he came to stand near its centre in a way that later generations could hardly miss. His life, then, is not best told as the tale of a single heroic moment. It is better told as the history of a mind learning how to see slowly, and of a man living quietly enough to hear the long argument of evidence. In that stillness, his story begins. Charles Robert Darwin was born on the 12th of February, 1809, in Shrewsbury, a market town in Shropshire whose red brick buildings and soft river landscape belonged to the settled, prosperous England of the early 19th century. He was born into comfort, but it was a comfort with strong intellectual currents running through it. His father, Robert Waring Darwin, was a successful physician of imposing presence, practical judgment, and considerable wealth. His grandfather, on his father's side, was Erasmus Darwin, physician, poet, inventor, and speculative thinker, a man whose intellectual restlessness ranged widely across nature and society. On his mother's side, the family belonged to the Wedgwoods, whose name was associated with industry, refinement, and the kind of prosperous dissenting culture that valued improvement, seriousness, and disciplined work. It was, in other words, a household in which money and intellect had already met each other. The boy born into it did not grow up in scarcity or insecurity. He grew up in a large home, the Mount, set above the River Severn, with gardens, servants, and the physical space in which a child could wander, gather, observe, and imagine. The domestic atmosphere seems to have been affectionate, though structured, and, like many children of that era, he was shaped as much by the temper of the household as by direct instruction. He had older siblings, a lively family circle, and access to books, conversation, and the habits of educated people. The most significant loss of his early life came when he was only 8 years old. His mother, Susanna Darwin, died in 1817. The memory of her remained strangely faint in his later recollections, as though grief had been absorbed into silence. He recalled little beyond fragments: a black velvet gown, a deathbed scene, a sense of absence. It is one of the more curious facts of biography that some of the deepest early losses remain the least clearly narrated. Her death left the household more heavily shaped by his sisters and father, and perhaps also by the emotional reserve common in many families of the period. As a child, he showed no sign of being a prodigy in the conventional sense. He was curious rather than precocious, absorbed by collecting shells, minerals, coins, beetles, and bird eggs, often with that peculiar intensity found in children who are less interested in performance than in possession and classification. He loved the search for things. He liked arrangement. He liked naming. There is already, in these youthful habits, a distant outline of the man to come. Not because childhood hobbies somehow predestined a scientific career, but because they reveal a pleasure in noticing variation, in making distinctions, and in holding the world still long enough to compare one thing with another. At school in Shrewsbury, where he attended the institution run by Dr. Samuel Butler, he was not regarded as especially distinguished. The education was classical, centered on Latin and Greek, with heavy emphasis on memorization and little regard for the natural sciences that would later define him. He later remembered these years with some dissatisfaction, not because he despised learning, but because the curriculum and his temperament did not align. He found poetry and ancient languages less compelling than chemistry experiments, field pursuits, and practical curiosity. His father, observing this, sometimes worried that his son seemed more interested in dogs, shooting, and rat-catching than in the duties expected of a respectable young man. Yet beneath the ordinary narrative of a boy not thriving under a classical education, something important was taking shape. He was learning, perhaps indirectly, that the official forms of distinction did not necessarily reveal where his powers lay. Many notable lives contain a period in which the world mismeasures a person because it uses the wrong scale. In this case, the mismatch was not dramatic. He was not a tormented genius in exile from understanding. He was simply a boy whose mind was more alive to hedgerows, specimens, and observations than to recited verse. The broader England of his childhood mattered as well. This was a nation in the midst of profound change. Industry was transforming landscapes and social relations. Commerce and empire were expanding. Scientific societies, lectures, publications, and collections were becoming more prominent within elite culture. Geology, natural history, and improvement of many kinds belonged increasingly to the respectable pursuits of educated men. To pay close attention to the natural world was no longer merely a rustic pastime. It could be part of a wider intellectual seriousness. He was born into precisely the class that could turn curiosity into vocation if the right path appeared. In those early years, another quality formed almost invisibly. He became a watcher. Not a visionary in the romantic mode, but a watcher in the practical English sense. Someone willing to look at small differences, repeat observations, and remember details. There is often less grandeur in such a beginning than history later prefers, but there is also more truth. Before he ever crossed an ocean, before he wrote a line that would trouble theologians and thrill naturalists, he was a child of gardens, cabinets, country walks, and a household where thought and order had already become part of the air. If his early life had given him habits of observation, his youth introduced him to uncertainty. His family expected him to become useful, respectable, and established. The precise form of that future, however, remained unsettled for some time. In 1825, at the age of 16, he was sent to the University of Edinburgh to study medicine, following the professional path of his father and grandfather. It was a reasonable choice for a family such as his. Medicine was learned, respectable, and financially secure. Yet the fit was poor almost from the beginning. Edinburgh was intellectually vibrant, full of lectures, societies, and the cold air of a northern city alive with inquiry. But it was also the site of experiences that repelled him. Surgery in that era was performed without anesthesia, and the sight of operations caused him deep distress. He found the lectures dull and difficult to endure, the formal study uninspiring, and the prospect of becoming a physician increasingly remote. His failure there was not a failure of intelligence so much as of calling. He did not possess the composure required for blood and suffering in the clinical setting, nor the disciplined enthusiasm needed for medical study as it then existed. Yet Edinburgh was not wasted time. In the gaps left by official disappointment, another education began. He spent time at the shore collecting marine organisms. He associated with men interested in natural history. He joined the Plinian Society, a student group where scientific topics, including controversial ones, could be discussed with unusual freedom. There he encountered ideas about transmutation, material explanations of life, and the close study of humble organisms. He also worked with Robert Edmund Grant, a zoologist who studied marine invertebrates and admired Lamarck's evolutionary ideas. He would later distance himself from Grant's speculative style, but the encounter mattered. It placed him in a world where nature was not merely admired, but questioned. The Edinburgh years also exposed him, in quieter ways, to the darker realities of empire, including the social presence of slavery's consequences. He met John Edmonston, a formerly enslaved black man from South America who taught him taxidermy. The lessons were practical, but the encounter itself may have widened his sense of the world beyond English respectability. Edmonston had known tropical forests firsthand. In later life, Darwin would remain a determined opponent of slavery, and some of the feeling behind that conviction may have roots in such early meetings when the abstract structures of empire acquired a human face. By 1827, it was evident that medicine would not do. Robert Darwin, disappointed but still pragmatic, proposed another path. His son might become an Anglican clergyman, a common and acceptable destination for educated men of good family who were not drawn to law or commerce. The church offered income, status, and time for gentlemanly pursuits, including natural history. So, he went to Christ's College, Cambridge, to take the degree required for ordination. Cambridge has often been remembered as the place where his scientific life truly began, though at first it hardly appeared so. He was sociable, fond of riding, shooting, dining, and the pleasures available to a young man of means. He was not yet the grave figure of later portraits. He enjoyed company, collected beetles with something like competitive fervour, and moved in a world where scholarship mixed easily with leisure. But beneath the relaxed exterior, his interests were clarifying. One of the most important influences there was the botanist John Stevens Henslow, a clergyman naturalist whose combination of piety, learning, and personal kindness made a deep impression. Henslow did not merely instruct him in botany. He modelled a form of disciplined observation and intellectual generosity. Darwin became known informally as the man who walks with Henslow, which suggests both the closeness of their association and the way reputations quietly form within institutions. Through Henslow, he met others, entered networks of inquiry, and began to see natural history as something more structured than enthusiastic collecting. Another major influence was the geologist Adam Sedgwick, with whom he spent time in North Wales learning field geology. This experience sharpened his sense of how landscapes could be read as records of deep processes rather than static scenes. The stones of hills, the layering of strata, the forms of valleys and deposits all suggested time, movement, and causation. Such habits of reading the earth would become crucial later, when the grand scale of change required by evolutionary thought needed a world old enough to contain it. Cambridge also introduced him to books that mattered greatly, particularly William Paley's works on natural theology. Paley argued that the intricate design seen in nature implied a divine designer, much as a watch implies a watchmaker. Darwin admired the clarity and logic of Paley's reasoning. This admiration matters, because his later break with fixed design did not emerge from ignorance of theological arguments, but from long acquaintance with their strength. He understood the beauty of the order he would eventually reinterpret. By the time he completed his degree, he was not yet a radical, not yet even a fully formed scientist. He remained in many ways an uncertain young man, sociable, somewhat aimless by conventional standards, but increasingly marked by unusual powers of attention and by a growing place within the networks of natural inquiry. What he needed next was not a doctrine. He needed a world large enough to test his habits of seeing. That world soon arrived in the form of a ship. The opportunity that changed his life came with remarkable contingency. His Majesty's ship Beagle, under the command of Captain Robert Fitzroy, was preparing for a surveying voyage that would take it around the world, especially along the coasts of South America. Fitzroy wanted a gentleman companion who might also serve as a naturalist. Henslow and others recommended Darwin. His father at first objected, seeing the voyage as a distraction from a settled career, but family persuasion, especially from his uncle Josiah Wedgwood, helped overcome those objections. Thus, a young man not yet ordained, not medically trained, and not securely established, found himself on the edge of one of the most consequential journeys in scientific history. He sailed in December of 1831. He was 22 years old. The voyage lasted nearly 5 years, and its influence cannot be reduced to a single revelation among exotic islands. It was, rather, an extended education in variety, scale, and comparison. He saw coastlines rise from the sea, forests dense with unfamiliar life, plains stretching under enormous skies, volcanoes, earthquakes, coral reefs, fossil bones, birds, insects, lizards, and the differing habits of peoples living under widely varied conditions. The world became not an illustration of a single static plan, but a field of variations, adjustments, and historical traces. South America affected him profoundly. He travelled inland in Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and Brazil, collecting specimens and recording observations with extraordinary energy. He encountered tropical forests that seemed almost overwhelming in richness, and he also crossed drier landscapes where life appeared sparse but no less instructive. In Brazil, he was appalled by slavery, and his writings reveal moral revulsion rather than detached curiosity. The human world, no less than the natural one, entered his thinking as something marked by cruelty, adaptation, and inherited structures. Among the most significant experiences were his fossil discoveries in South America. He found the remains of giant extinct mammals, including forms related to modern armadillos and sloths. This juxtaposition mattered deeply. Why should extinct creatures from one region resemble living creatures from that same region? The pattern suggested connection through time rather than independent placement. It was not yet a complete theory, but it was the kind of fact that stays in the mind, unresolved and quietly pressing. Geology also transformed him during the voyage. He had taken with him the first volume of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which argued that the Earth's features were produced over immense time by slow, continuous processes still observable in the present. This approach, often called uniformitarian, gave him a new way of reading landscapes. An earthquake in Chile, which he witnessed directly, and the uplift it caused, helped confirm for him that dramatic geological structures might indeed result from cumulative changes across long spans. The Earth ceased to be merely ancient in an abstract sense. It became active, historical, and legible through process. The Galapagos Islands, visited in 1835, later became inseparable from his fame, though their importance at the time was more gradual than legend suggests. He noticed variations among mockingbirds from different islands, and later came to understand the significance of the finches, whose forms differed according to feeding habits. More broadly, the islands raised the question of why closely neighbouring places should contain distinct but related forms of life. The patterns were geographical and historical at once. Isolation seemed to matter. So did local conditions. The old assumption that species were fixed and separately created in their present forms no longer sat easily with such evidence. The voyage itself was not serene. He suffered badly from seasickness. Shipboard life could be cramped and tense. Fitzroy, brilliant and intense, was not always easy company. There were long separations between captain and naturalist, intervals of strenuous travel inland, and continual demands of collecting, writing, preserving specimens, and managing correspondence. Yet Darwin thrived intellectually because the journey gave him exactly what his mind required, not doctrine, but abundance. He did not merely see more of the world, he saw that the world contained order without obvious simplicity. When the Beagle returned to England in 1836, he was no longer an uncertain young gentleman with a taste for beetles. He had become something else, though not yet fully visible even to himself. He had notebooks full of observations, crates of specimens, and entry into scientific circles that quickly recognized the importance of what he had gathered. More importantly, he had acquired questions that could not easily be set aside. The facts of distribution, fossil succession, geological time, and variation among organisms had begun to assemble themselves into a problem. The shape of the answer still lay ahead, but the direction of thought had changed permanently. It was possible, after such a voyage, to return home and become known merely as a traveller naturalist. He did become known for that, but he was already moving beyond description. The journey had not given him a final doctrine, it had given him a lifetime's work. The years after the voyage were in some respects quieter than the voyage itself, but they were intellectually more decisive. Darwin settled into the patient labour of turning observations into knowledge. He published his Journal of Researches, often known later as The Voyage of the Beagle, and quickly gained a reputation among naturalists and geologists. He worked closely with specialists who examined the specimens he had brought back. He entered London Scientific Society, attended meetings, and corresponded widely. Yet the social centre of his career would prove temporary. Increasingly affected by recurring illness, and perhaps temperamentally disinclined toward urban demands, he moved in 1842 with his wife Emma to Down House in Kent. There, away from the noise of London, one of the great theories in science was slowly assembled. His marriage to Emma Wedgwood in 1839 brought companionship, domestic structure, and emotional complexity of a high order. She was intelligent, affectionate, musically gifted, and deeply attached to him. Their union was close and fertile. They would have 10 children, though not all survived to adulthood. Yet their marriage also contained a gentle tension regarding religion. Emma retained a more conventional Christian belief than her husband eventually could. He knew this difference might pain her. Their surviving letters show not a grand ideological conflict, but the quieter and more poignant reality of two loving people thinking differently about ultimate things. At Down House, he developed a mode of life that would become almost monastic in its regularity. He rose, walked, wrote, rested, corresponded, experimented, received visitors selectively, and took repeated turns on the sandwalk path to think. Illness shaped this rhythm. For much of his adult life, he suffered from bouts of nausea, vomiting, fatigue, palpitations, eczema, headaches, and various other symptoms. Historians and physicians have debated the cause, suggesting possibilities ranging from psychosomatic strain to chronic infection to an inherited condition. No definitive answer has settled the matter. What is clear is that illness constrained him, but it also pushed him into a life in which concentrated work at home became possible. The theory of natural selection did not spring complete from his mind. It formed across years of reading, note-taking, comparison, and hesitation. By the late 1830s, he had already begun notebooks on transmutation, asking whether species might change over time, and, if so, by what mechanism. The crucial conceptual breakthrough came after reading Thomas Malthus on population in 1838. Malthus argued that populations tend to increase faster than resources, leading to struggle, restraint, and competition. Darwin saw that if organisms vary, and if more are born than can survive, then favourable variations might be preserved, while unfavourable ones disappear. Over many generations, such selection could shape species. This was the core insight. Yet insight alone was not enough. He wanted evidence broad enough to sustain it. He studied domesticated animals and plants, especially pigeon breeding, because artificial selection offered a visible analogy to what nature might do more slowly and without intention. He investigated barnacles in exhaustive detail, spending years on what may seem to later readers an improbably narrow subject. But that work deepened his grasp of variation, classification, sexual difference, and morphology. He gathered facts about geographical distribution, embryology, anatomy, and the succession of fossils. Everywhere he looked, the idea of descent with modification seemed to illuminate patterns that fixed creation did not explain as well. Why then did he delay so long before publishing? The answer is not simple cowardice, though fear played some part. He knew the implications were immense. A theory that treated species as mutable and humans as part of the same natural history as other animals would unsettle religious assumptions, social sensibilities, and established habits of thought. He also knew the scientific case had to be carefully made. He was not by nature a hasty controversialist. He preferred the security of abundant evidence. There was prudence in his delay, but also temperament. In 1844, he sketched an extended essay setting out his theory, and he left instructions that it should be published if he died. That private step shows both conviction and caution. He knew what he thought. He simply had not yet chosen to face the world with it fully. Meanwhile, the domestic life at Down House continued. Children played in the garden. Experiments were conducted in hothouses and flower beds. Letters arrived daily from breeders, gardeners, naturalists, and friends. The household became both family home and research station. One of the great achievements of his mature life was to make the ordinary materials of country existence scientifically productive. He did not stand above life as a remote philosopher. He used gardens, pigeons, climbing plants, earthworms, orchids, and the habits of children and dogs as evidence. He saw continuity where others saw separation. The small and familiar became central. This was not a science of laboratories alone. It was a science of attentive living. Everything changed in 1858 when Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist working in the Malay archipelago, sent him an essay outlining a theory of species change by natural selection strikingly similar to his own. Darwin was stunned. A thought he had carried privately for 2 decades had emerged independently in another mind. 2000. With the help of Lyell and Joseph Dalton Hooker, a joint presentation of Darwin's and Wallace's ideas was arranged at the Linnean Society. Shortly afterward, he set aside the vast manuscript he had planned and wrote a shorter abstract. The result, published in 1859, was On the Origin of Species. The book did not thunder. Its prose was measured, careful, and cumulative, yet it changed the terms of the conversation. He argued that species were not fixed creations but the descendants of earlier forms, shaped over immense periods through natural selection, acting on variation. He did not claim to explain every difficulty, and indeed he openly acknowledged many, but the explanatory power of the theory was immense. What had once seemed isolated facts became connected. Fossils, anatomical similarities, geographical distribution, vestigial structures, and classification all entered a single historical account of life. The revolution, true to his character, arrived not in a shout, but in a sustained argument. The publication of On the Origin of Species made Darwin internationally famous, but fame was only one part of its consequence. More important was the gradual reordering of scientific thought. The book did not persuade everyone immediately, nor did it answer every objection. Yet, it made the transformation of species intellectually unavoidable as a problem and increasingly plausible as a fact. Even those who resisted natural selection often found themselves moving towards some version of evolution. He had shifted the terrain. What exactly had he done? At the broadest level, he replaced a static conception of life with a historical one. Organisms were no longer to be understood solely as isolated creations fitted to fixed roles. They had ancestries, they had relations, they bore traces of prior forms within their anatomy, development, and distribution. The natural world, like the geological world, had a past that remained present in structure. Natural selection gave this historical account a mechanism. It showed how cumulative change might arise without foresight or separate acts of design. Variation existed. More organisms were born than could survive. Those with traits advantageous in given conditions tended, on average, to leave more offspring. Over long periods, this differential survival and reproduction could produce adaptation and divergence. The elegance of the idea lay partly in its simplicity, but also in its refusal of drama. No single event needed to occur. Countless small events were enough. His achievement was also literary and methodological. He wrote in a way that guided readers through complexities, rather than dazzling them with assertion. He used familiar examples, especially from domestication, to make immense conclusions feel accessible. He conceded objections, anticipated confusion, and invited thought rather than merely issuing proclamations. In this sense, On the Origin of Species is not only a scientific text, but a work of persuasion in the highest intellectual style. After 1859, he did not stop. The years that followed produced a long sequence of books deepening and extending his ideas. The variation of animals and plants under domestication explored inheritance and the effects of breeding. The Descent of Man applied evolutionary thinking explicitly to humanity, arguing that human beings shared common ancestry with other animals and examining sexual selection as a powerful force in evolution. The expression of the emotions in man and animals traced continuities between species in gesture, feeling, and bodily display. His books on orchids, climbing plants, insectivorous plants, and earthworms revealed a mind still fascinated by detail and by the ways large principles could be illuminated through humble cases. His work on sexual selection deserves special notice because it widened the explanatory field beyond mere survival. Beauty, display, preference, and competition among members of the same species could shape form in ways not reducible to direct struggle against environment alone. Feathers, songs, antlers, ornaments, and mating behavior became part of evolutionary history. The living world grew stranger and richer under this account, not flatter. Adaptation was no longer just utility. It included attraction, rivalry, excess, and the many curious elaborations of life. The household at Down remained central to this productivity. Emma managed much of the practical and emotional life around him. Children assisted at times with observations and experiments. Correspondence flowed in from around the world. He built knowledge collaboratively, though always through the filter of his own judgment. He depended on breeders, gardeners, pigeon fanciers, colonial observers, collectors, and fellow scientists. His genius was not solitary in the romantic sense. It lay partly in drawing together enormous amounts of distributed observation into a coherent argument. There was also quiet courage in the steadiness with which he continued. The reactions to his work were intense. Some readers welcomed it as brilliant and liberating. Others regarded it as morally dangerous or spiritually corrosive, Caricatures depicted him with ape-like features. Public debates turned heated. Yet Darwin himself remained relatively restrained, rarely entering theatrical controversy. He let allies, especially Thomas Henry Huxley, fight many of the louder battles in public. Huxley's style was sharper, more combative, more suited to lecture halls and disputes. Darwin's was quieter. He answered criticism with further evidence, revisions, correspondence, and patient continuation. The influence of his work extended beyond biology, though not always in ways he intended or would have approved. Philosophers, theologians, social theorists, and political thinkers all wrestled with the implications of evolution. Some tried to reconcile it with religious faith. Some used it to support harsh ideologies of struggle and hierarchy. Others found in it a humbler picture of humanity's place in nature. He himself was cautious about broad moral or political extrapolations. The trouble with powerful ideas is that they often outgrow their author's control. Still, the heart of his contribution remained scientific and historical. He taught later generations to see life as branching, contingent, and unfinished. He made relationship the key to understanding diversity. He turned the living world into a genealogy. That change has never entirely ceased unfolding. Genetics, paleontology, ecology, molecular biology, and modern evolutionary theory would later revise, strengthen, and complicate his framework. But the central shift remains his. After Darwin, life could no longer be described adequately without history. No serious life is without contradiction, and Darwin's is no exception. The calm authority of his published work can sometimes make him appear more settled than he was. In reality, he was full of hesitations, revisions, private anxieties, and unresolved tensions. Some belonged to science, some to religion, some to family, and some to the larger intellectual climate of Victorian Britain. His religious views changed gradually rather than through dramatic renunciation. In youth, he had accepted much of Anglican orthodoxy and even prepared, at one stage, for clerical life. The natural theology of Paley once seemed persuasive to him. But as his scientific thought developed, and as he reflected on suffering, extinction, parasitism, and the often harsh workings of nature, confidence in traditional doctrines weakened. The death of his beloved daughter Annie in 1851 appears to have deepened this estrangement, though it did not create it from nothing. By later life, he seems best described not as a triumphant atheist, but as an agnostic, or at least a cautious unbeliever, a man unwilling to affirm more than he thought evidence permitted. This shift carried emotional cost. Emma's faith mattered to her, and Darwin knew that his uncertainty might wound her. Their correspondence reveals tenderness rather than rupture, but also the ache of divergence. It is one thing for a theory to unsettle the public world. It is another for it to pass quietly through a marriage, altering the background assumptions by which two people understand death, meaning, and reunion. There were also scientific gaps in his work that troubled him deeply. He did not possess a convincing theory of heredity. He understood that variation must somehow be transmitted, but the mechanisms available to him were incomplete or mistaken. Critics pointed out difficulties in the preservation of favourable traits under blending inheritance. He tried to address such problems, sometimes unsuccessfully. Modern genetics would later supply what he could not. This should not be counted simply as failure. It is the condition of nearly all foundational thinkers that they see further than the tools of their own age. Another contradiction lies in his relation to the social thought of his period. He opposed slavery sincerely and forcefully, and he affirmed the common humanity of all peoples. At the same time, he remained a Victorian Englishman, shaped by assumptions and hierarchies common to his era. Some of his writings contain rankings of societies and speculative judgments that later readers rightly examine critically. He did not invent scientific racism, nor does his central theory require it. But like many 19th century intellectuals, He moved within a world where empire, classification, and hierarchy often bled into one another. To read him fairly is not to ignore that context. Perhaps the most troubling legacy associated with his name is not his own argument, but what others made from it. The phrase social Darwinism, though often historically imprecise, refers to attempts to turn ideas about natural struggle into prescriptions for human society, justifying competition, inequality, imperial dominance, and neglect of the weak. Much of this owed more to Herbert Spencer and others than to Darwin himself. His work described natural processes. It did not simply command that human moral life imitate them. Yet once human beings were placed within nature's continuum, many readers drew harsh conclusions. A scientific theory became, in some hands, a social weapon. This pattern reveals a general truth about ideas of great explanatory power. They are rarely left within their proper bounds. They travel, they are simplified, moralized, distorted, enlisted. His calm prose could not prevent that. No author of consequence fully governs posterity's uses of his thought. There were also personal contradictions in his temperament. He was gentle but tenacious, modest in manner, but fully aware of the importance of his work. He avoided many public battles, yet cared greatly about scientific judgment. He could be scrupulously fair, though not free from the desire to defend priority when his ideas were challenged. The Wallace episode was resolved with dignity by most accounts, but it still placed him in the delicate position of protecting decades of labour while sharing credit with a man who had reached a similar conclusion independently. Even the familiar image of Darwin as a serene naturalist in his garden can hide the strain under which he lived. Illness shadowed him. Publication frightened him. Criticism pained him. Family grief marked the household. The tranquility of Down House was real, but it was not simple peace. It was peace made necessary by vulnerability. What makes him compelling, then, is not purity of thought or life, but the way a deeply imperfect human being held himself to evidence with unusual loyalty. He did not resolve every contradiction. He lived among them, and in that, perhaps, he becomes easier to understand. As Darwin aged, the rhythms of Down House became even more settled, and the atmosphere around him more evidently autumnal. He remained productive, but the quality of his later years was shaped by repetition, bodily limitation, and the deepening emotional weather of family life. The world knew him as a great naturalist. At home he was also husband, father, patient, correspondent, and walker of the same familiar paths. Annie's death had long remained one of the great sorrows of his life. She died at 10 years old, bright and beloved, and the loss seems to have affected him profoundly. The family endured other illnesses and anxieties as well, though there were also pleasures, marriages, grandchildren, and the ordinary consolations of domestic continuity. Victorian households were rarely untouched by death, and the Darwin home was no exception. The difference lay, perhaps, in the degree to which his scientific understanding of nature's indifference stood alongside personal grief that could not be reasoned away. His health remained uncertain. He structured his days around what he could bear. There were prescribed hours for work and rest, strict habits, limited visits, and periods of incapacity. Yet the limitation did not extinguish curiosity. In old age, he turned to subjects that suited his manner perfectly: the movement of plants, the action of worms in soil, the subtle agency of small forms of life in shaping the earth. There is something quietly beautiful in the way his attention descended as years advanced, not toward grandiosity, but toward minuteness. His final book, On Earthworms, treated creatures so ordinary that polite society might have overlooked them entirely. Yet he showed that even worms, moving slowly through soil over long intervals, could transform the ground itself. This preference for modest subjects was never merely quaint. It expressed a principle at the core of his worldview. Great results need not come from grand actors. Life changes through accumulation. Landscapes change through repeated small acts. The world is made by patience as much as by force. His appearance in these years became iconic. The large beard, the thoughtful eyes, the lined face of the venerable sage. Portraits turned him into a kind of secular prophet. Yet the man himself remained attached to routine rather than grandeur. He worried over proofs, revised editions, answered letters, and measured observations. Visitors who came to Down often encountered not a thunderous intellectual, but a courteous, somewhat fragile gentleman, hospitable within limits, gentle in conversation, and earnest in scientific exchange. Recognition accumulated. Honours arrived from learned societies and universities. His books circulated widely across Europe and beyond. Younger scientists grew up in a world that now had to reckon with his ideas. Evolution was debated, revised, attacked, defended, and gradually woven into the fabric of modern thought. He lived long enough to witness not final victory, but substantial transformation. That experience can be ambiguous for any thinker. To see one's work accepted is gratifying, but it also means seeing it simplified, disputed in unfamiliar forms, and turned into common currency beyond the control of its maker. Emma remained his closest companion through all of this. Their marriage, tested by difference in belief and by years of illness, endured with remarkable tenderness. The letters, household memories, and recollections of children suggest an intimacy built less on intellectual sameness than on affection, humour, and steadfast care. Great historical lives are often narrated as solitary arcs. His cannot be told honestly without the domestic circle that held him. By the early 1880s, his strength was diminishing. He had lived long by the standards of many 19th century contemporaries, and long enough to become an institution. There is a quiet dignity in such an ending when it is imagined without sentimentality. The familiar rooms remain, letters still arrive, garden paths are still walked, if more slowly. The study is still full of specimens, drafts, and unanswered questions. Outside, the seasons continue their indifferent turning across the Kentish countryside, as they had before his birth and would after his death. For a man who had given history back to nature, it was fitting that old age itself should appear not as theatrical decline, but as gradual reduction. The radius of activity narrows. The mind still works, then tires. The house grows quieter. The work table remains where it always was, and the long labour of a life begins, gently, to come to rest. Charles Darwin died on the 19th of April, 1882, at Down House. He was 73 years old. The cause was associated with heart problems, though. As with so much in his medical history, the exact language of diagnosis belongs imperfectly to the time. What mattered immediately to family and public alike was that a figure long associated with one of the century's greatest intellectual transformations had passed from the living world. There is often something revealing in the reaction that follows death. The controversies of a person's life do not vanish, but they are rearranged. Hostility may soften, admiration may formalize, and the dead are often carried into broader national narratives than those they inhabited while alive. This happened in his case with striking clarity. Although he had lived much of his mature life as a private country gentleman working from home, public sentiment quickly elevated him to the rank of national sage. A decision was made that he should be buried in Westminster Abbey. This was no small honour. The Abbey belonged to the ceremonial heart of British memory, where monarchs, statesmen, poets, and distinguished national figures were laid to rest. To place Darwin, there was to acknowledge that his work, however unsettling to older certainties, had entered the permanent story Britain told about itself. He was buried near Isaac Newton, a symbolic arrangement almost too clear to require explanation. England was placing one interpreter of nature beside another. The funeral itself carried a restrained grandeur. Friends, colleagues, dignitaries, and representatives of institutions gathered not for a spectacle of private grief, but for a public act of recognition. It is worth pausing over the significance of this. A man whose theories had once seemed dangerous to established belief was now being honoured in one of the most sacred spaces of the nation. History does not always move by open reversal. Sometimes it moves by absorption. What first appears threatening is later given a place in the architecture of permanence. Yet the responses were not uniformly simple. Some critics remained uneasy about the moral and spiritual consequences of his ideas. Others honoured the scientific achievement while remaining unconvinced by all its conclusions. Public consensus is rarely complete, especially around thinkers who change first principles. Still, the tone surrounding his death was one of respect rather than rancor. Whatever battles had been fought around evolution, Darwin himself was now widely seen as serious, honest, and immense in intellectual consequence. For the scientific community, his death marked the passing of a central figure, but not the end of the debates he had shaped. Indeed, some of those debates were only beginning their fullest development. The mechanisms of heredity remained unresolved. The fossil record continued to pose challenges and opportunities. The relation between evolution and human society would generate arguments, insights, and distortions for generations. His death did not close a system. It left behind a field of inquiry still moving. At the level of family memory, the loss was more intimate and less monumental. For Emma and the children, the death was not the removal of a statue, but the absence of a husband and father whose routines had long defined the household. The study, the walks, the voice at table, the familiar daily structure of illness and work, all these would have become suddenly historical within the house itself. Public fame can never fully translate that smaller silence. The immediate legacy of his death, then, was double. Nationally and intellectually, he was canonized. Domestically, he was mourned. The distinction matters. History often prefers the public version because it is easier to narrate. But the truth of a life lies partly in the fact that both forms of aftermath occur at once. The newspapers print notices, institutions speak, scholars assess, and meanwhile, a chair in a house stands empty. He left behind not a completed doctrine immune to revision, but a changed mode of thought. That was already clear in 1882, and it has only become clearer since. The world that mourned him was not the same world into which he had been born. In the span of one life, the fixity of species had been broken, and the history of life had become irrevocably part of modern consciousness. A copy of On the Origin of Species, resting quietly on a shelf, can seem, at first glance, an unassuming remnant. It is not physically grand. It does not glitter. It does not announce itself with marble or bronze. Its pages hold arguments, examples, cautions, analogies, and patient prose. Yet within such a book lies one of the great reorientations of human thought. Through it, and through the many years of work behind it, Darwin left not merely a theory but a new habit of seeing. He changed how living things are understood in relation to time. That may be the simplest way to say it. Before him, life could still be imagined by many educated people as a set of fixed forms placed into the world in something like their present arrangement. After him, life had ancestry. It had branching descent, extinction, adaptation, divergence, and deep continuity. Human beings were not exempt from this history. They belonged to it. However much later science revised the details, this historical imagination remains among his greatest gifts. There is humility in that vision, though not always comfort. It reduces human separateness. It asks that pride give way to kinship and certainty to process. At the same time, it enlarges the natural world beyond anything static design could easily contain. The living earth becomes a vast unfolding of relations, accidents, selections, losses, and survivals across spans of time almost too large to feel. He did not diminish nature, he made it deeper. His legacy also includes a style of thinking. He taught the value of accumulation over proclamation, of patience over haste, of allowing a question to remain unsettled until evidence could bear more weight. That style can seem almost old-fashioned in periods that prefer quick declaration, yet it has an enduring moral force within intellectual life. To look closely, to revise, to doubt one's own argument, to gather more facts even when already half convinced, this too is part of what he bequeathed. There are, of course, shadows within the inheritance. His work was misused, simplified, and bent towards social cruelties he did not design. Some of his own assumptions remain marked by the limitations of his era. No great figure escapes history's mixed judgment, but judgment becomes wiser when it resists both idolatry and dismissal. Darwin does not need sanctification to remain immense. He only needs to be seen clearly, and perhaps the clearest way to see him is to return, gently, to that house in Kent, to the study with its papers and specimens, to the garden paths and the sandwalk. Not because greatness always resides in rooms, but because in this case the room tells the truth. The scale was domestic, the labour was repetitive. The discoveries grew within a life outwardly narrow and inwardly vast. He did not rule a country, command an army, or found a church. He watched earthworms, he wrote letters. He worried over pigeons and orchids, he paced, he thought. And from that stillness came a changed account of life. Sue. There is something settling in that image. History is not made only by noise. Sometimes it is made by a person willing to remain with a question for years, until it yields a shape that can be spoken plainly. He did that, and the plainness of the speech was part of its power. The book remains. The idea remains. The branching tree of life, revised but still recognizable, remains. And, beyond the pages, the older rhythms remain too. Hedges in wind, soil underfoot, creatures burrowing unseen, seeds taking hold, forms changing slowly beyond the limits of any single life. In that long continuity, his own life now rests, where all lives eventually rest, inside history rather than above it. The room is quiet. The papers are still. The path outside runs on through the garden and away into evening fields. And the great argument he helped begin goes forward without haste, in the same patient world he spent so long learning how to observe.